O God, creator of all life, bless the unsung lives of countless Christian women in every century who were your hands and feet, who kept alive your compassionate presence by feeding the hungry, nursing the sick, clothing the naked, comforting the sad, praying and petitioning, strengthening those in prison, teaching the stories, sowing and singing, weeping and rejoicing. Grant us the wisdom to discern our ministries in this day as our foremothers found theirs. Lead us in new and timeless forms of discipleship, and let us joyfully find our place in the procession of praise, offering our varied gifts and voices together with them and Mary, the mother of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Welcome to each and every one of you. This is our third year that the Episcopal Women's History Project has offered a Lenten series. And the series are women presenters who have become knowledgeable in many different ways of different women who perhaps you haven't even heard of yet. But today we're going to have a presentation that, of course, you will have heard about the Philadelphia 11, the first women who were ordained priests. So I want to introduce Heather Hyuck, who is going to give this presentation. Just a minute. Okay. Heather is a church historian, or a woman's historian, I guess we could say. And she has done all kinds of things to do what the mission is of EWIP, to make sure that women's history doesn't get lost. She's known especially for her book about American history, Doing Women's History in Public, a handbook for interpretation of museums and historic sites. As a longtime historian, she has the particular expertise on how to research, preserve, and interpret the history of American women in an effort to tell the whole story. Having taught, written, and organized in women's history, this is her skill. We welcome her to our stage and look forward to hearing her experience not only with being at the ordination herself, but many other deep avenues that she went into to know more about all the different women who were ordained and all about the significance of the importance of this to the Episcopal Church. I invite Heather to begin.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and welcome to all of you. I'm delighted you're here, and I'm sure that Jeanette Piccard and the others are with us in spirit, at least. So in the winter of 1974, I was a grad student at the University of Minnesota, and I heard a woman preach. I was fascinated by her. And so I invited her over for dinner. It was a grad student dinner of spaghetti. Before dessert, she had me signed up for a committee on the ordination of women. That was early 1974, and the woman was Jeanette Piccard. At the time, I had no idea that she was as famous or accomplished. I might not have invited her if I'd known that, but I found her fascinating, and I found her to become a really dear friend and special person. So this presentation today is based on my years of knowing Jeanette, on a dissertation biography of Jeanette Piccard by Cheryl Hill, my own dissertation, and a lot of work in the Piccard papers at the Library of Congress. So when I'm quoting, I'm often quoting from those sources. I also want to thank her grandchildren, Jane Piccard and Dick Piccard, who have helped, as well as the Reverend Dr. Olive Bozarth Campbell, another of the Philadelphia 11. I once complained to Jeanette about being impatient. She would have none of it, telling me forcefully, "There are many ways to wait. I did." And let me share my screen.
Get it?
Jeanette was one of a whole community of amazing Episcopal women: Deaconess Brown, the Reverend Sue Hyuck, the organizer for the women, known as the Bishop to the Women, Alla Bozarth Campbell, whose book Diamonds in a Stony Field has just been published, and of course, the amazing Reverend Dr. Polly Murray, who was so generous in lending me her files and helping me as well. Jeanette was born in 1895 and lived until 1981. She did many, many things during those years, and I want to talk about them now. She grew up in a wealthy family in Evanston, Illinois. Her father, a very distinguished orthopedic surgeon.
Does everybody, excuse me, Heather, can everybody see the slides?
No,
I
No.
cannot.
you have not got the screen shared, Heather.
All right, hold on. Thank you for letting me know. Let's take it from the top.
Okay.
Yes, the show is important.
If-
All right, I'm hitting shared screen, right?
Yeah, and then you have to pick the right, you have to have the slides open in another.
Here
There
we
you
go.
go. She's
File.
got it. She's got it.
There
Okay,
we
there we
go.
go.
All right,
Oh,
everybody, my
wow.
apologies.
No, that's okay.
I'm a historian, not a
There we go.
technician.
Woo!
All right, everybody, here we go. So
Okay.
Marion Brown in the upper left, Sue Hyatt in the lower left, Alla Bozarth celebrating her 40th anniversary of her ordination, and Polly Murray. As I said, 1895 to 1981. She was born in Evanston, Illinois, in a wealthy family. Her father, Dr. John Ridlin, was an eminent orthopedic surgeon. Her mother, Emily Robinson, a classic Victorian woman. But she lost her twin sister, her identical twin sister, at age 3 when they were playing with a toy stove, but real matches. Her sister caught on fire and died 3 days later from the burns. Jeanette said she needed to live for both of them, and she did. Otherwise, her family was fun and rambunctious. When a beau asked her older sister to marry him, if she would cease dancing and behave more properly, her sister told him she could not reject her family ways and rejected him. Jeanette encountered other Protestants, but clearly was an Episcopalian ever since, quote, a dear old lady friend, quote, had invited her to go to church. She loved its rituals and its beliefs. When she was 11, her mother asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up. The correct answer, of course, was mother and having many children, like her own mother of 9, who had 9. Instead, Jeanette said she wanted to be an Episcopal priest. Mrs. Ridlin fled the room in tears. For her, she was expected to be a debutante and then get married and have children. Her determined approach to life showing early. Instead, she wanted to go to college. Do you really want to go to college? Her father asked. Yes, sir, I do. To which her father said, very well then, you shall go. Here you see it says she entered Bryn Mawr in the fall of 1914 with President M. Carey Thomas. But in fact, she had to go spend a year at the Shipley School to get ready to go to Bryn Mawr. She struggled, but she got in. And at Bryn Mawr, President Thomas had the approach to interview each of the 102 incoming students to ask them what they wanted to do and wanted to be. When she asked Jeanette, Jeanette said, I want to do something impossible. I want to be a priest in the Episcopal Church. President Thomas encouraged her, telling her, I'm sure that would be possible by the time you graduate, my dear. Yes, there's some chuckles here. At Bryn Mawr, Jeanette wrote a long and thoughtful paper arguing for women priests in the Anglican Communion. She found that women had the necessary intellectual, moral, and physical abilities to be priests, presumably including herself. She recognized gender differences, but argued for equality, and noted that while men had, quote, more brute strength, unquote, women endured more pain at childbirth, except for men when wounded in war. And this is, of course, during World War I. While dated, she wrote the paper in 1916. It remains powerful. While she initially struggled academically, she graduated with honors. Her father again offered good advice. She should become a chemist to relieve a man at the front and to have a livelihood if she didn't marry. By then, she'd already rejected 2 suitors. At the University of Chicago, she was initially fearful of her chemistry professor, the tallest, thinnest man she'd ever seen, the Swiss chemist Jeanette Piccard, who had left his prestigious post in Belgium when the Germans invaded there. Jeanette and Jean found commonality in both being identical twins and worked well together. When Jeanette realized she was in love with Jean, who seemed to be oblivious to his feelings, she again consulted her father. Dr. Ridlin asked her if he was the only man in the world like Jean, and if she was prepared to follow him anywhere. She laughed. Jean had a twin brother, also eminent in the balloon world, Auguste Piccard, who was quite famous already for his balloon work. Jeanette's family was concerned that she wanted to marry a poor immigrant chemistry professor rather than a wealthy businessman. So this 1965 entry, while accurate, is quite misleading. She did not go to the University of Chicago to find a husband, but what a husband found her. They had a strong, complementary, and deeply loving 44-year marriage. They married in August 1919, right after Jeanette defended her master's thesis. The instant she married Jean, she lost her American citizenship by marrying a foreigner. They moved to Switzerland where he taught, and they soon had 3 sons. In 1926, they returned to the U.S. just before the Great Depression hit and upended so many lives. That year, Jeanette received some genuine support for becoming an Episcopal priest. When the Bishop of Delaware, Philip Cook, encouraged and blessed her and set her on a course of study. She already had a spiritual advisor, Father Powell of the Anglican Society of St. John the Evangelist, whom she had met years ago at Bryn Mawr and who supported her for many years. When she had asked her bishop in Chicago for references about women priests, he had scoffed at her. In response, she became expert on Tertullian and St. Paul, writing along in defense of St. Paul, which was a constant argument that she and I had about St. Paul. Anytime we wanted to argue, it was about St. Paul. Jeanette took being a mother very seriously as being Jean's partner. Like her own childhood home, theirs was a lively one. She once told me they resolved a family debate about how cats can land on their feet. They set up a landing spot, somehow tied the cat's tail to its legs, and proved that a cat's tail is crucial to it landing safely. Years later, her son Paul was disgusted when a seminary refused Jeanette admittance because they said they lacked a bathroom for her. His response? She's lived with 4 males for years. But the family struggled financially during the Depression. Jeanette noted her life seemed full of dishes, dirt, and debt. And when her youngest son was a baby, their kitchen caught on fire, becoming a mass of flames. Jeanette raced to the 2nd floor where her 3 sons were sleeping, got the 2 oldest out onto a bay window, and then rescued the youngest. She showed the determination that was such a refrain in her life. The next day, she had nothing but deep gratitude towards God. Quote, "In broken, disjointed words, I thanked God." In her essay, Why I Go to Church, she dismissed many reasons for going or not going to church, but she knew that she would always find a friend, God, there. Today, we don't really appreciate the magnitude of their flight to the stratosphere to do scientific research on cosmic rays. In 1934, it was a big deal. To make the flight, Jeanette needed a pilot. Jean needed a pilot so that he could do the research. So in 2 months, Jeanette became the first American woman licensed as a balloon pilot. She later quipped, "I didn't go up with him. He went up with me." Thanks to their son, Donald, who popularized sport ballooning, we are nonchalant about sport and weather balloons. But then, airplanes and balloons were still experimental, with frequent fatalities. Determined to continue with high-altitude balloon research, the Piccards struggled to find sponsors for their stratosphere flight, eventually piecing together the required support. Getting sponsors to pay for the very extensive endeavor, about $227,000 today, was extremely difficult. It was the Great Depression, Jean had lost his job, and the equipment and hydrogen gas to fill the balloon was expensive. The National Geographic, their logical sponsor, refused to have anything to do with sending, quote, "a woman and a mother on such a dangerous expedition." Other companies also refused. Their landlord generously forgave months of rent. Son Paul later joked that no one seemed to be concerned about a father, a breadwinner, risking his life. The Piccard fundraising included selling the souvenir booklet, which lists Jeanette as the pilot. So he did the science, she did the piloting. But as I say, it was a very big deal. Henry Ford lent his field for the launching. Orville Wright came and met their son. 45,000 people watched their very early morning liftoff, which included 300 men in the ground crew. Going up nearly 11 miles in their enormous balloon, Jean researched cosmic rays. They set the altitude record that Jeanette held for women until Valentina Tereshkova exceeded it in 1963, nearly 30 years later. But sadly, clouds obscured their earthly view as they crossed Lake Erie, going from Detroit to nearly West Virginia. They didn't know where they were. Concerned they not end up in the Atlantic Ocean, they set down after their 8-hour, 300-mile record-setting flight. They always hoped to go up again and go higher to 100,000 feet. But the Great Depression, World War II, and their inability to get funding prevented their dream of return. Their 7-foot diameter gondola, which is a pressurized capsule, was packed so tight with scientific experiments, including 168 Geiger counters to measure cosmic rays, that the two of them, who had now been married for many years, kept bumping into each other and then apologizing until they agreed that that was silly. Their passenger, the family turtle, Fleur de Lis, was not bothered. Early on, some rigging was malfunctioning, so Jeanette put on her parachute, climbed completely out of the gondola, somehow held on and fixed the problem. She said, quote, "I was the pilot. It was my responsibility." She wrote this long telegram to publicize the event as part of their fundraising effort. Interestingly, the copy at the Library of Congress has a sentence crossed out, which reads, quote, "The angels, if there be angels, which I doubt not, will keep us safe and enjoy the trip with us, though we shall not see them." For Jeanette, science and religion were not in conflict, but reinforced each other, science helping us appreciate the wonder of God's creation. Jeanette found the experience of the stratosphere flight reinforced her faith. She uncharacteristically struggled for words to describe the upper atmosphere. Quote, "The sky at the stratosphere is a very dark blue, about the color of the sky just after sunset when the stars are beginning to appear. This very, very deep blue." Although the sentence is crossed out, I think it reflects her beliefs. Some Episcopalians lean towards its Protestant tradition and others as Catholic. Some Episcopal churches avoid stained glass, while others have stations of the cross, incense, and sanctus bells and address priests as Father. Jeanette belonged to the Anglo-Catholic wing. She claimed she disliked incense, but clearly loved the ritual, and for her, Eucharist was especially crucial to her life. Although she focused on family and ballooning during these years, and they are known as the royal family of ballooning, and anyone who's ever watched Star Trek, they are named, Captain Piccard is named after the Piccard family. Her priestly calling remained. She was ready, but the church was not. Finally, in 1936, Jean got a job at the University of Minnesota teaching aeronautical engineering, and life improved. Apparently, Jean's strong accent made Americans struggle to understand him. Jeanette was a faculty wife, but she was much more, attending Jean's lectures and working beside him, but not, of course, being paid. 6 years later, Jeanette finished her own PhD in education and then tried unsuccessfully over and over and over to get a job for herself. In response, she wrote, quote, "Wasted women," decrying that women spent their lives in preparation, in being wives and mothers, and then from ages 45 to 64, while full of energy, left to play bridge, golf, and, quote, "be busybodies," unquote. Quote, "But when she tries to transfer her energy to productive work, she runs into social opposition and meets with prejudice on every side." As World War II came, she unsuccessfully tried to join the military effort. As all three sons fought and Jean traveled to London to interrogate German prisoners, Jeanette hung 4 blue stars in her window. This was her home until she died, and until her son Don died, and it was the scene of many visits and good times in her house. Apparently, the realtor.com was showing her house when it was empty, and I have to tell you, it was never empty at all when she was there. It was always piled with books and papers, and there were balloons in every window. It was a fairly small house, but a nice one. And it was a good house for a faculty family. Jeanette, during these years, worked to establish a church-based school, served on the vestry and the altar guild, and as we say, she lived the gospel. As Minnesotans, she and Jean had a cabin at Lake Vermilion as their retreat. In 1969, the bishop gave her a lay reader's license to perform services, but only at their lake cabin and only in the summer. Jeanette clearly wanted more. Her granddaughter stayed in bed one morning and Jeanette brought the service to her. The woman was relentless. And you can see the body language of this picture and how they just were a wonderful pair and really there for each other. Then in 1963, Jean died. His former student, Robert Gilruth, now head of the NASA manned space program, asked Jeanette to become a NASA consultant. She loved the role, which gave her extensive speaking experience and work. Gilruth and his wife, Ruth Gilruth, had been Piccard students at the University of Minnesota. He deeply respected her, explaining, quote, "She was very bright, had her own doctor's degree, and was at least half of the brains of that family, technically as well as otherwise. She was always in the room when Jean was lecturing, almost always. She was something. She was good." He enlisted Jeanette as a publicist, sharing the program and goals of the space program. Her NASA employment later made a huge difference in her financial situation, which had been quite bleak. And here we see Jeanette as lady and scientist wearing a first stole, and it's hard to see, but there's a gold cross as well. In those days, it was very unusual for a civil servant to wear a gold cross in these situations. Again, for Jeanette, science and religion were there together. One of the things I found in preparing for this talk was her efforts at some writing and a prayer, which you can see here. But by the mid-1960s, Jeanette was becoming increasingly displeased with the church's attitudes towards women. Covering her head and wearing a hat became a sign of discrimination and subservience. She contrasted herself with her Victorian mother, who wouldn't leave the house without a hat and gloves, while she, quote, "trotted about in slacks," unquote. She said, "At the very least, it is time for the clergy to stop emphasizing sex differences by fussing about who wears what on whose head when," unquote. She quit wearing a head covering to church, seeing it as a male-imposed badge of inferiority, saying, "I took off my hat." Being so respected as Dr. Piccard by NASA made her even more unwilling to accept discriminatory treatment in the church. Yet she faithfully attended church conventions, general convention after general convention, and remained extremely active in her parish. And she made a key move. She moved from the longtime elite Anglo-Catholic parish of St. Paul's on the Hill in St. Paul and moved to St. Philip's, a smaller Black parish in St. Paul. Rector Denzil Carty was a civil rights warrior and who supported her priestly call. The St. Philip's congregation welcomed Jeanette. And then in 1970, the Episcopal Church changed the canon on the diaconate and recognized women as deacons. The two bishops of Minnesota ran into Jeanette and happily declared, "Now we can do it." Now they could ordain her a deacon. And she was ordained at St. Philip's with its rector, Denzil Carty, here, and her daughter, Jane, as well. Her ordination to the priesthood would not be as seemingly uncomplicated for any of them. I hope you see her hair up and the wonderful smile on her face, because you can begin to see that she was generally a very joyful person with a lot of humor and determination. In 1972, she was assisting as a deacon at St. Philip's. Her son, Paul, a political science professor, characterized her growth as evolving from an aristocrat to a Democrat. Becoming much more involved with the Black community was key to her evolution. And then in 1972, although she had extensive formation in the Episcopal Church, she went to General Theological Seminary for a year, a 77-year-old grandmother who relished the experience. Other early seminarians included Dr. Pauli Murray, who had just left her tenured professorship at Brandeis. And I can only imagine what a class with the two of them would have been. I would love to see it. And I would not have wanted to gotten in the crossfire if they had disagreed. Just before the 1973 General Convention in Louisville, Jeanette predicted that between women's ordination to the priesthood and the proposed changes on marriage to allow divorced people to remarry, quote, "It promises to be an exciting 2 weeks." It certainly was. It was bitterly disappointing. Canonical change for women's ordination did not pass. The opposition had organized, which it hadn't in 1970 when it looked much more problematic or much more possible. The Episcopal Church women voted against it. The new presiding bishop opposed women priests. Many meetings followed. By early 1974, when I first met Jeanette, she was deeply discouraged. Already past retirement age, she questioned if she would live long enough to become a priest. She served as a deacon and preached wherever she could. And then, in early 1974, in July, a phone call came. Did she want to join the technically illegal ordination being organized at Philadelphia? Some women found it too risky or simply lacked the courage for such a bold step. Jeanette did not hesitate. Quote, 11 of us said, "Yes, let's go ahead." And her 79-year-old presence lent gravitas and helped counter arguments that these women were just a bunch of women's libbers, one of many charges against them. Her former rector, now retired Bishop Daniel Corrigan, ordained Jeanette. Photographs show a swarm of clergy covering each of the ordinand's heads. Joy and fear of violence mixed. The church's rector, one of the heroes, the Reverend Paul Washington, later mused that the Church of the Advocate had previously hosted the Black Panthers, and they weren't worried. This was a group of middle-aged white women. Yet the Advocate was the only church willing to host them. Sue Hyuck, who had been a suburban missioner, had close ties there. Several of the women deacons had deep civil rights ties. Its Black senior warden, Barbara Harris, received her call to the priesthood during that service and later became the first woman to be consecrated an Episcopal bishop. As the oldest, Jeanette was ordained first. She had waited the longest. And here, if you look carefully, in the middle is Reverend Denzel Carty's bald head, her son John, and there in the middle is Jeanette. And I hope you can see there was a huge congregation. The place was packed. It was very hot that day, and there were very happy and excited people, and particularly many lay participants who deeply wanted women priests almost as much as the 11 women themselves. There were also several objectors who looked like they'd just stepped out of a Dickens novel. They claimed that ordaining women had the, quote, scent of perversion and was schismatic with the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. These embittered groups called them priestesses with all its pagan connotations. After the excitement of the Philadelphia ordinations was a difficult time. The presiding bishop, the new one, declared, quote, the ladies are not priests, confusing being theologically irregular with being invalid. Irregular meant not all canon laws were followed. Invalid meant no sacrament had occurred. Opponents of women's ordination believed the sacrament of ordination could never take for a woman because women were improper matter. They likened human females to rabbits. One man explained to me that only men could be priests because only women could be mothers. They claimed that women could not become priests because a woman might be pregnant, and what would happen to her baby, which is easy. The baby wasn't planning to get ordained, hadn't passed anything, it wasn't qualified. Or that Jesus was a male, raising the equally silly idea that had Jesus been female, only women could be priests. We should not forget the anger and antipathy that some men and women felt as other men and women were their strong champions. Church courts tried the 2 priests who let the women celebrate the Eucharist at their churches. And in July 1975, Minneapolis, we held a happy celebration which featured both of the Minnesota women priests, Jeanette Piccard and Olive Bozarth Campbell, who renewed their priestly vows. And you'll notice we also featured balloons in honor of Jeanette and her stratosphere flight. In September 1975, 4 more women were ordained priests in Washington, D.C. The church was in turmoil. The summer of 1976 was intense as we got ready for General Convention. 3 groups worked for women's ordination to the priesthood. One group, the Episcopal Women's Caucus, focused on education. Another, the National Coalition for Women's Ordination, strictly on changing canon law, which others said wasn't necessary. The third, Women's Ordination Now, had proceeded with the ordinations and were focused on supporting the 15 women priests. The Washington Four were crucial because they showed that Philadelphia was not the only time there would be women priests, and that more ordinations and women priests would follow. The 3 groups sometimes worked together, but often rubbed against each other. Some in the canon law group even questioned whether the Philadelphia 11 had helped their cause at all. Some supporters of the 15 women priests feared that they would, quote, be sold down the river, unquote, as the price for changing canon law. The summer of 1976 was busy and intense as the General Convention came to Minnesota and the 3 groups jostled. And here you can see us just hanging out at her house, having a good time. And you'll notice that she's still in her clergy. She wore that constantly. It may be gone now, but once there was a very small window between the window and the back door. That small door opened to a compartment for the milkman to leave milk bottles. This was Minnesota, after all. To enter Jeanette's house, you opened the small door, twist your hand around, reach for the house key, and unlock the back door. I will always cherish seeing Jeanette standing at the top of her stairs to the second floor after I broke in by that milk door. I needed to wake my mother so she could unexpectedly leave to send my grandfather off to his next life. Jeanette heard my break-in, and there she was, her long white hair flowing down, wearing her long white nightgown, asking who was there. Just me. We went into her bedroom, where my mother was sleeping, and Jeanette very gently roused her. She ministered to my mother, exemplifying loving care. My mother flew to New York just in time to say goodbye to my grandfather. Thank you, Jeanette. The vote passed on September 7th, 1976. My grandfather had died the day before. And here we see Jeanette and her granddaughter, Catherine Piccard, who also sought and ended up being an Episcopal priest, and a look of great concern, because this was a time of great fear and worry as to what was going to happen to the 15, in contrast to where Jeanette wore her, I would call it her uniform, and you can see her cross and her, I don't see a balloon there, but she had a balloon pin that she wore, and two of the pins, this one was the Women's Ordination Now pin, and I think that was the National Coalition pin. After the vote passed, the New York Times quoted the Reverend Carter Hayward, another of the 15, who accurately stated, "This has not been an event. It has been part of a process that has been going on for decades. While the principle had been accepted, the fate of the Washington 4 and Philadelphia 11 remained. Initially, the House of Bishops voted to force the 15 to be, quote, reordained, a bizarre theological concept. Miraculously, the House of Bishops reversed themselves and authorized each of the bishops with women priests in his diocese to decide how to proceed. Nor did the Episcopal Church split in half, as some opponents had predicted." And then, in January of 1977, at St. Mark's Cathedral in Minneapolis, Bishop McNary of the Diocese of Minnesota held a service welcoming Jeanette and Alla as priests. They were regularized into full status as Episcopal priests in a joyful service, where 18 months before, Roman Catholic women had committed themselves to fasting and praying for their Episcopal sisters, which means we still owe them some fasting and praying. Later, the next Bishop of Minnesota, Bishop Anderson, made the Reverend Dr. Jeanette Piccard an honorary canon at the cathedral. She deserved it. So as she said, there are many things you can do while you're waiting, and she certainly did them all. She had waited 68 years before she could become a priest, and next year it will be 50 years. These are the buttons that have now been designed for people who help us with the film, and I am going to ask that the wonderful film on the Philadelphia 11 be shown, the trailer, because this is getting ready for the 50th anniversary, and we really appreciate all of you listening, and we will answer questions afterwards. We hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you very much, Heather. That was wonderful. We have one comment. Joan, would you like to tell your story?
You've never had an election.
Sure. When I was my parish as a layperson in South Bend, the minister there was very much opposed to women's ordination. He tried all of the things that were brought up. You know, we would be splitting off from the Roman Catholics and causing a bar. And I just looked at him on that one and said, well, sometimes we need to lead the Catholics. And then he went on, women can't do it because they might have a baby on Sunday morning and not be able to be at church. And I said, usually you have a pretty good idea on a pregnancy and you can schedule supply clergy. What do you do when a man has a heart attack? And he just sputtered because he couldn't come up with an answer. So yeah, it was those kinds of things were being mouthed all around the church at that point by high church people.
Yes, and they were mouthed for a couple decades after it.
Oh, yeah.
Probably yet today. But I'll tell my story, and it's a good one for me. Pan gave a talk a couple of years ago about Peggy Bosmeyer, who was the first woman priest in Arkansas. And when I went to the Commission on Ministry in 1990, and she was the president of the commission, and it was August, and she was pregnant with twins at the time. And we had a wonderful conversation, and I said, do you think I can do it? And she says, if I could do it, you could do it. And it's what you're saying, Joe, that her church loved her and cared for her and went with her through this journey. And it's a wonderful thing. Heather, I'm just so amazed. I learned so much today. Not only theological things, but the Piccard name being for the Star Trek. That's a good one.
Well, and I have to tell you that Jeanette was a terrible housekeeper. She didn't like to do housekeeping. She thought that was a waste of time. But she had enough of the Victorian in her that she didn't want her silver to be tarnished. So she always put camphor balls, mothballs in her silver drawers. She claimed that would mean they wouldn't get tarnished. And we had many a debate about that because it makes vanilla ice cream taste terrible.
Oh, God.
So I hope you have a feeling of her as a real person, as well as the many ways that she showed both physical and emotional and intellectual courage. And when she wrote that paper and she said, we have to think about our men, our priests, our women intellectually, physically, and emotionally capable of being priests. She had thought about it pretty carefully.
Indeed.
There's some questions, though.
I do want to give this. Nancy Houston wrote, I heard Jeanette Piccard speak several years ago. Among other things she told us was that the feat she and her husband ascended was the height stating one has traveled in space.
When you get that high, you're in the stratosphere, and there are different definitions that turns out as to when you're technically in space.
Yeah.
So the easy way to say is almost 11 miles. And and we fly at, I think, about 35,000 feet. So to go up that high, and when she got out of the gondola, she was about at 8,000 feet. She knew that if she didn't get out then, it was going to get more difficult. And she actually slid in the process of getting out. And so it was quite a feat to do that. But that's how would not have survived at that high altitude. They wouldn't have gotten up there had she not fixed it.
Pan Adams speaks for all of us. She says, Heather, thank you for your presentation today. A reminder of perseverance and resiliency. And that is true. It's amazing that it happened, but then it's amazing that it didn't happen before. So
it had been debated since 1920 in the Anglican Communion, and deaconesses before. And every single role, whether lay reader or vestry, was struggled over. Every single one.
I could add, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
When I was in high school, the suffragan bishop in Colorado was
Corrigan.
What? Right.
Corrigan.
Yeah. And he was amazing person, very tall. And we called him the guy that write the letter.
Ichabod Crane.
Yeah, Ichabod Crane, because he was so tall and his thing was so tall. And when he was elected in Colorado, he was also elected, I think, in Minnesota at the same time. And ultimately, the writing bishop called him and said, you can choose whichever you want, but if you go to Colorado, you'll save a diocese. And that is actually what he did. He was that, and I can imagine him saying, okay, let's get these women adored. He was that kind of guy. He was willing to take way out there in the church where it needed to be. He was a remarkable person.
The night before the ordination, the ordinands and the bishops and very few family members, I was not part of it, met to get ready. And Bishop Wells was hesitating whether he would ordain Katrina Swanson, his daughter. And his grandson said, and tomorrow I'm looking forward to my grandfather ordaining my mother. And that made the difference.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And I have to,
so great.
I have one more story for you. There was a bishop who was a good guy generally, but not being at all active in women's ordination. And we were puzzled by that. And suddenly he got very active. And when I did my interviews, I asked his wife what had happened. And she said, well, one morning, she said, our shower had a glass door. And one morning when he was in the shower, I said, dear, it's time to deal with women's priests. The poor man wasn't going to get out of the shower. That's why you have Mary Clark.
It's great.
And he switched.
I have a story from the Diocese of Massachusetts. My name is Betty Lane. I worked in the 70s for women's ordination, doing a lot of education. But then I was also able to attend a celebration by Carter Haywood at Woods Hole before the 76th General Convention. And that was it's like one of the highlights of my life.
Right.
And then I also was able to be at the 76th General Convention. And so it was, it's been a journey, and I've loved every minute of it.
Yes, indeed.
During the 76th General Convention, the Bishop of Minnesota had told Alla and Jeanette they were not to celebrate in public, period. And they didn't, but Alla was having services a lot at her house upstairs. So there were a lot of quiet celebrations.
Yeah.
I might just point out, Corrigan was elected Bishop of Quincy at the same time as suffragan of Colorado.
Right.
Was referred to as two-way Corrigan, an allusion to the pilot wrong-way Corrigan who
Right.
flew to Ireland instead of someplace else. But Corrigan had gone to seminary with the Bishop of Colorado and thought he could work with him, and it turned out not to be the case. So he was given a position as director of the home department of the church's headquarters, and it was that was why he ordained me to the priesthood when I was a graduate student at General Seminary. Only he was not acting on his own. He was acting for the Bishop of Los Angeles under license from the Bishop of Newark and with certification of a position from the Bishop of Northern Indiana. So it was, I suppose you might say, triply canonical, but he was a wonderful person. I wrote, he thanked me for allowing him to do it for this wonderful service in a little blue collar parish in New Jersey. And I wrote to him on the 10th and 25th anniversaries and got a nice reply. He was very sentimental. I wasn't surprised that he had taken part in the Philadelphia event. And I'm glad to meet you, Heather, after having corresponded with you and even talked on the phone when I was writing an article on the subject and benefiting from your, I think, very well written and objective dissertation on the subject.
Thank you. Well, Yes, it was finished in 1981. You can never know when your past will come back and haunt you. Are there other questions that people have?
Yeah, there were several comments. Sarah Pritchard talked in her comment. Are you able to unmute and tell your story?
I think so. What's her name?
Sarah Pritchard.
Sarah Pritchard, and a longtime friend of Heather's as a research librarian at the Library of Congress when Heather was doing research in Washington. And at that time, Elizabeth Carl was also a research librarian at the Library of Congress, who shortly after I worked with her in the 1980s, became ordained as a lesbian and was at the time considered the first openly lesbian. Now, maybe it's the first openly lesbian who was actually in an open relationship, depends on which church history timeline you look at. But I became quite fascinated with the number of women and men that I encountered over the years who either were in ministry and left it and became librarians, or were librarians and went into the ministry. And I feel as if there's a dissertation lurking in there about the commonality. Maybe it's the intellectualism or the spirit of service in those two fields. But I do remember that we were all very admiring of Elizabeth's courage, because even in 1991 in Washington, D.C., even after all the events that Heather has so beautifully documented, it was still not easy, especially working in a federal agency, to just be an open lesbian, let alone seek ordination.
Right.
Thank you. Yes.
Right. Absolutely. Yes, I was on the Commission on Ministry years after I was ordained, and we still struggled with the Commission on Ministry wanted to be open to ordaining lesbian and gay people, but it was hard. We were still struggling. That was in the 2000s. Oh,
I've got a question for Margot.
okay. Good.
Margot, are you aware of the video of Bishop John Hines at the 73 convention stating that there are no theological reasons why women should not be ordained in this church? The problem is a pastoral one. Have you ever seen that video?
She might not still be there.
Margot, are you gone? I don't see her. She might have left.
She's here.
Hello,
She's
can you
coming.
hear me?
She's here. Okay.
Go ahead, Margot.
Right? I had to pick up my son and his friends, so I've been listening. But what was the question?
Okay.
I didn't hear the question.
The question is, are you aware of Bishop John Hines' statement at the 73, his final address to convention, stating that there are no theological reasons why women should not be ordained in this church? The problem is a pastoral one.
I am not familiar with that statement, no.
I've got the video. I shot the video of that.
You did.
So I'll make it available to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so
Yay.
much.
Yay. Well, thank you all so much for being here. And I'm sorry about our snafu last week, but I think we have a wonderful talk that has been recorded and will be up on YouTube for anyone who was not able to attend this presentation today. I want to invite you all to tomorrow is our fourth session that we will have the Reverend Dr. Lauren Francis Winter, and she will tell the story of Sarah Patton Boyle, who was one of Virginia's most prominent white civil rights activists. So I hope that you can come. And again, we have all of our talks are on YouTube. So if there's something you weren't able to attend, you can go see these at your leisure. And I would end by inviting you all to become part of the Episcopal Women's History Project. The purpose is exactly what's happening with this Lenten series. The purpose is to keep the history of women in the Episcopal Church alive, be it people who are famous or people who nobody knows about yet. So we're always trying to get a combination of all of those, so that you know in your parish or in your work, of people whose lives are incredible. They're doing wonderful ministry, but perhaps they have not been on the forefront. So if you want to bring them to our attention and get involved with EWIP, I welcome you to do so. So I hope we will see you tomorrow. Thank you for being here, and thank you for spreading the good news. Thank you, Heather.
Welcome. Thank you.
Great. It was great.
Until tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Everyone.